So a lot of times what we're trying to do in preaching is that we take a New Testament concept and put it back into an Old Testament concept, and it just sometimes it don't fit. And so, because that's how we come up with, for instance, like women are to keep quiet, silent in the church, or women are supposed to keep their hair short or long and wear a cap. What we're doing is we're taking the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, we're taking New Testament concept that was designed for that time and not for today. Vice versa in the Old Testament, they did a whole lot. The Jews today, they still are trying to keep the Old Testament laws and sacrifices that are no longer in effect. And so it's really kind of interesting as you look at that. But it is also possible to say that God uses such means as personal, national, international crisis to judge sinful people even today. Before the end of time, God is still saying the tribulation period is still coming. It's going to happen. I can assure you I'm coming back, but in the meantime I want you to stay faithful. Don't give up. Keep working. Keep faithful in your service for the Lord. But in either case, the only hope people have is the hope that Isaiah had to offer. And here's what he had to offer to the people of Isaiah. In 722, you're going to get invaded and you're going to be destroyed. But in the meantime, here's what the Lord offered. To make the Lord our fear and to believe in His Word and to hope in Him. That's not in your notes. But that's what I'm saying is here's what the Lord is. To make the Lord our fear and to believe in His Word and to hope and to hope for Him. And so I think that is what you're trying to do as we look at this text. And as we go through it, is that you'll see that that is basically what perhaps that I am also trying to do. Whereas I enjoy going verse by verse and taking that verse and breaking it down to mean something that would be interesting. Now notice chapter 8. If you will read verse 1. If you'll read verse 1, Richard.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8 and verse 1.
All right. Moreover, the Lord said unto me, Take thee a great roll and write in it with a man's pen concerning Marshallah-has-Baz.
And then let's okay. And then we went through. I'm trying to buzz through there because I think we left off. The last time we left off was, let's see, I think we left off at verse 16. I was thinking about just going back over some of these verses to look at. Let's look at verse 16. Frankie, can you read? You have your.
I got it.
Okay.
It's not too long, so I can read it.
Is it a big one?
No, it's a little one.
Okay.
Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples.
That's a powerful statement, you know. Bind up the testimony. Bind up. The verse is difficult to interpret, and one needs to be careful not to be dogmatic. But one writer interpretation says that Isaiah, that his writings were sealed up and committed to his disciples to be published at some later date when events would have vindicated him and them, in light of the fact that the law and the testimony together could denote the general revelation. So, bind up the testimony may refer to anything which is narrow and confining, and in this context, meaning to tie or to wrap up, and so to safeguard them from tampering. The testimony means attesting our testament. The testament is a solemn declaration or affirmation made to the purpose of establishing or proving some facts in context. So when he was talking, and that can always get in trouble because when everything the president says, they can go back 20 years and bring up something that you said. You remember that lady was she was head of the housing department somewhere, and they were going to do something, and someone didn't like her, so they went back 20 years to find a speech that she had, that she said something that sounded like that she was against equal rights 20 years prior. And what they did, they took a little bite out of a 45-minute lesson, and it sounded like that she was prejudiced against white people. And they brought it up, and her boss fired her. He called her up on the phone, told her to pull over, and he said, "You're fired," for something that was attributed to her 20 years ago. When in fact, when they showed the whole thing in context, it was just the opposite of what they thought she said.
Didn't they have to rehire?
And they wanted, they had to rehire, but after that, I don't think did she take the job?
I don't think she did.
I don't think she wanted to take the job.
I just know that part.
Isn't that terrible? To make a judgment based on something somebody said out of context. Yeah. And I'm saying is, we all say things. I've said things to my kids 20 years ago that I wish I hadn't said.
Me too.
I'm glad that they don't. Dad, you remember what you said 20 years ago, that you'd buy me a car when I graduated from high school? Now, I may have said it when they were 3 years old, but by that time I didn't have the money to do it when they graduated. He said, But so, everything that Isaiah was saying, God said, why don't you take it and bind it up, put it in the book, put it in the tablet, and write it down. And the affirmation is, it's going to show that everything that you have prophesied is going to happen. And it was written out, and it's going to be sealed. It describes the action of signing a document and then placing a personal seal on it. And it describes the act of sealing something to make it secure. And the most likely meaning in this present passage, the meaning could indicate the nuance of that it's going to finally take place, and it will happen, and nothing can stop it or hinder it from taking place. Once he said it's been sealed, and it's going to take place. A lot of times, we don't you think that we've heard so much of it could happen, the apocalypse could happen in October? How many times has it happened so far? How many signs have been put up over the last year saying this date is going to happen? No? And it hasn't happened yet. So we tend to think, well, is it ever going to happen? And we tend to get lack. The point is, I could go see the Lord tomorrow. I'm not waiting for something disastrous to happen. I want to be sure that when it does happen, I'm going to be ready. I'm not going to go do like that guy did, to take that little child and go down in a bunk. He must have been deranged or somewhere in order to do that. But he already had his little what?
A bunker.
His bunker. You remember back in the 50s when Eisenhower was born, I went out in my I was probably the second or third grade. I went out in my backyard and I started digging me a hole so I could get in it. In case of war, of course, when it got about this deep, I never could get in it because it was just about this deep. In preparation, we have nothing to fear when it happens. Isaiah was telling the people there, this is going to happen, put your trust in me. obey my word. Don't try to ignore it. Don't try to get out of it. It's going to happen, and more likely you're going to be taken to captivity. More than likely you're going to die because of the decisions that your king has made. Our president of the United States makes decisions for us along with the government, and we have to put up with it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean our hope is in what he does. It's going to happen anyway. God is in control of history. He is in control, and in spite of what's around us, he still has the ability to take care of us, even though we could go socialist. I mean, hello, in America, we could have lived in Egypt. There are Christians in Egypt, in Iran, in Iraq. There are Christians in parts of Africa and China and Japan. But we're still to be obedient to the Lord, even in the midst of all of that. So, the instruction, or the law, referred to the prophet's exhortation and warnings. And when the people are judged for their sins, the prophet can produce these earlier messages and essentially say, I told you. I want to say that so often to people. Did you not hear my sermons? I was telling Charity the other day. I said, did they not hear my sermon? Where were they? They sit in the classroom. They sit in the class and they hear me talk. And if they miss it, they could listen. They can get my notes, or they can listen to it on tape. And they turn right around and do just the opposite of what I'm saying. It sounds like children, doesn't it? Does it? Mm-hmm. Richard, you and I don't do that, do we? We've learned the hard way. But, I mean, time and time again, I'm glad that, I'm talking about young people in particular. I'm talking about, I don't know if I want to get that, they made a comment last week about, I probably shouldn't get too personal, but they turn right around and make, you know what I'm talking about, make a decision that is so far out, so far ignorant, that breaks every single rule that God wants them to do, and they don't think anything about it. And that, of course, we know that. We all have had that to happen to our, to people that we're talking about. And so I can come back and say, this is what I taught you. You were sitting in the classroom on a such and such a day, and here's what I said, and you turn around and do just the opposite. And so what God told Isaiah, you have written down the instructions. In this way, he can authenticate his ministry and impress upon the people the reality of God's authority over them. And so he was very clear. He said, write this down so I can show you. And then he goes on to say in verse 16, the natural question is, to whom does my refer to? Read verse 16 again. Oh, did you read verse 16? What did it say again? Bind.
Bind up the testimony.
Seal the law, unnoticed.
Is the word my in there?
My disciples.
My disciples. That word my, it's when you look at that verse, the natural question is, to whom does my refer to? The prophet or Jehovah? Jehovah, is it God's disciples or Isaiah's disciples? If it refers to Isaiah, the verse would read almost like the prayer that God preserved when Isaiah had taught his disciples. Others favor that this my is a capital my, refers to God, and that he is essentially claiming the disciples as his remnant who have the privilege of possessing his testimony and his law. So I think you probably could go, you see what I'm saying there? In the King James, the word my is a little my, so you can't tell if that's Isaiah or if it's God.